No, ma'am. I never used drugs in my life. Okay, maybe a little, but not enough.
It was January 28th, 1975, just after breakfast, at a big colonial house in Teaneck, New Jersey. A task force of federal agents and detectives came through the door with guns drawn. Upstairs, the man's wife started throwing suitcases out the window. The suitcases were stuffed with cash, and they burst open on the lawn while agents scrambled to catch the bills. When the counting finally stopped, the total came to $584,683, worth around $3.5 million today. Prosecutors would call it pocket money. If you've seen American Gangster, you know the man in that house. Denzel Washington played him calm, precise, almost noble. Hollywood gave you the myth. Here's what actually happened. And the real story is wilder than the film, and darker, too. The man in the bathrobe was Frank Lucas, a sharecropper's son from North Carolina who could barely read or write, and who built the most profitable heroin pipeline in American history. He did the one thing no black gangster in New York had ever dared. He cut the Italian Mafia out of the drug trade completely, went straight to the source in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and lived to spend the money. His brand was called Blue Magic, and for 6 years it was the strongest product on the East Coast. This is the story of how a barefoot kid from LaGrange became the king of 116th Street, how a war in Vietnam became his supply line, and how it all ended with the biggest betrayal in the history of the American drug trade, a betrayal committed by Frank Lucas himself. And it leaves one question that nobody has ever fully answered. Not the DEA, not the courts, not Hollywood. Where does Frank Lucas, the gangster, end, and Frank Lucas, the story, begin? Because some of his legend held up in court, and some of it, as you're about to see, may be the greatest sales job ever pulled on the American public. Frank Lucas was born September 9th, 1930, in LaGrange, North Carolina, the oldest child of a poor sharecropping family in the depths of the Depression. No shoes half the year, stealing chickens to eat, and one memory he repeated for the rest of his life. Frank always said that when he was a small boy, Klansmen came to the family porch and killed his 12-year-old cousin Obadiah, accusing the boy of looking at a white woman. Historians have never been able to verify the story, but Frank told it the same way for 70 years, and he swore it was the moment something in him went cold. What's documented is what came next. Around 1946, at 16 years old, Frank hit his boss, grabbed money from the till, and ran north with everything he owned. He landed in Harlem, and Harlem in the late 1940s was a universe. Pool halls, numbers, runners, silk suits, and money moving through every doorway. Frank slept where he could, worked when he had to, and stole the rest of the time. By his own telling, he ran a one-man crime wave through the neighborhood, sticking up bars, snatching jewelry, taking crap games at gunpoint, until half the hustlers on 8th Avenue wanted him dead. The accounts vary on how much of that spree really happened. What's certain is that he was loud enough and dangerous enough that the most powerful man in the neighborhood finally noticed him. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, late 50s by then, silver-haired, soft-spoken, played chess in the park and quoted poetry, and had run Harlem's rackets for decades with the blessing of the Italian families downtown. The most respected black gangster in New York. Frank claimed Bumpy took him in, polished him, and kept him close for 15 years. Bumpy's widow told a different story. She said Frank was an errand boy at best, one of 50 kids hanging around the great man's shadow. The accounts vary, and they never stopped varying. What nobody disputes is that Frank spent those years watching how real power worked. Bumpy never touched product on a corner. Bumpy collected. Bumpy arbitrated. Bumpy sat down with the Italians as something close to an equal, and the Italians still kept the leash. Frank absorbed all of it, including the part he hated most. Even the King of Harlem was a tenant. Along the way, Frank found the one person he'd keep forever, a stunning young woman from Puerto Rico named Julie Ferrate, a former beauty queen who fell for him completely and stayed fallen for the next 50 years. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, famous for chicken and waffles at 4 in the morning. Bumpy Johnson's heart gave out at the table. Frank swore until his dying day that Bumpy died in his arms. Other men who were there swore Frank wasn't even in the room. Either way, the King of Harlem was gone, and Frank Lucas, 37 years old, watched the funeral and did the math. Harlem sold the heroin. Harlem took the arrests. And the Italians kept the money. Years later, he told a reporter exactly what he wanted out of life. Donald Trump rich. Those were his words. To get there, he was about to do something that should have gotten him killed. Understand how heroin worked in 1968. Turkish opium moved through French labs in Marseille, the pipeline they called the French Connection, and into the hands of the Italian families in New York. A Harlem dealer bought a kilo from the Mafia for up to $50,000, and by the time he touched it, it had already been stepped on, diluted, taxed at every handoff. The Italians owned the supply, so the Italians owned everybody. Frank's insight was brutally simple. Stop buying from the middleman. Find the source. And in 1968, the purest, cheapest heroin on earth was coming out of the Golden Triangle, the poppy country where Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet, which happened to sit next door to a place where 500,000 young Americans were fighting a war. Here's how the pipeline worked. The opportunity was Vietnam. Military flights moved between Southeast Asia and stateside bases every single day, and customs barely breathed on them. The inside connection was family. Leslie Ike Atkinson, a former Army Master Sergeant from North Carolina who ran a joint in Bangkok called Jack's American Star Bar, packed every night with black GIs on leave. Ike was married to one of Frank's cousins. Country boys, blood ties, no outsiders. The military police would eventually give Ike a nickname, Sergeant Smack. The execution started with a plane ticket. By 1969, Frank was in Bangkok, sweating through his suit in Jack's American Star Bar, while Ike made introductions. By his own telling, Frank then did something almost nobody in American crime had ever done. He went up country himself. Days of travel with a guide, into the Poppy Hills, to shake hands with a supplier he always described as a smiling man in the jungle who could deliver more product than all of New York could swallow. Maybe it happened exactly that way. Maybe Ike handled it and Frank improved the story later. What survived every version was the price, because the price changed his life. $4,200 a kilo. Nearly pure. The same product New York sold for $50,000 before the cut. The heroin came home hidden in shipments of teak furniture with false bottoms, in duffel bags, on military aircraft landing at bases like Fort Bragg, a short drive from where Frank and Ike grew up. The money worked like a miracle. A $4,200 kilo cut and bagged in New York came back roughly $250,000 on the street. Ike took his cut per kilo moved. Couriers earned a few thousand a trip. Frank kept the mountain. And the problem, the flaw buried in the whole design, was the thing that made it possible. The pipeline ran on a war, and wars end. You've probably heard the most famous part of this story, the coffins. For decades, the legend said Frank's heroin came home in the caskets of dead American soldiers, and the movie leaned into it. Ike Atkinson denied it until the end of his life. There were no bodies, he insisted, in so many words. It was furniture. Federal investigators documented the furniture. They never proved the caskets. The most infamous detail of the Frank Lucas legend may be exactly that. Legend? What wasn't legend was the product, because the product was tested in courtrooms. Frank branded his heroin Blue Magic, sold in $10 glassine bags with a name stamped right on them, and the marketing was purity. Think about what a brand means in an illegal market. No advertising, no storefront, no refunds. The stamp on the bag was the entire promise, and Frank protected that stamp the way Coca-Cola protects a formula. He raged when dealers cut his product further and sold garbage under his name, because every weak bag on the street was stealing from his reputation. Street dope in New York ran 1 to 3%. Blue magic hit the pavement around 10%, and addicts crossed boroughs to find it. His territory was 116th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue, and his workforce was blood. The Country Boys, his 5 brothers brought up from North Carolina, men like Ezell and Vernon Lee, because Frank trusted family and nobody else. The cutting mills moved between apartments in Harlem and the Bronx, and Frank always claimed the women who cut the product worked naked, so nothing could walk out the door. Inside the mills, the pure kilos were stepped on with quinine and milk sugar, bagged, bundled, and moved to the corners in waves. The numbers Frank threw around were obscene. $1 million a day in sales on his best days, worth around $6 million in today's money. A personal fortune of $52 million, much of it parked in the Cayman Islands. Federal agents could never confirm the peak figures, and Frank never stopped inflating them. What they could confirm was a ranch back home in North Carolina with 300 head of Black Angus cattle and a breeding bull that cost $125,000. Nobody buys a bull like that on a shoeshine income. Then came the night that ended it all, even though nobody knew it yet. March 8th, 1971, Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century, Ali versus Frazier, the hottest ticket in the history of New York. Frank sat ringside, closer than the Mafia bosses, wearing a floor-length chinchilla coat that cost $100,000 and a matching hat that cost $25,000 more. A gift from his wife, Julie Ferrate, a former beauty queen from Puerto Rico who adored him. Every camera in the building swept past him. And in the crowd, federal narcotics agents and detectives all asked each other the same quiet question. Who is that? Frank said later it was the dumbest thing he ever did, and that he never wore the coat again. Too late. He was now a face. He should have cashed out that night, $52 million, by his own count. Instead, he went back to 116th Street and ordered more kilos. 4 years later, the people it attracted will be standing on his lawn. Because the country was turning. On June 17th, 1971, President Nixon stood in front of the cameras and declared,
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
In July 1973, the government created a brand new agency with one job, the DEA. And New York was ground zero, because the bill for blue magic was coming due in the neighborhoods that bought it. By the early 1970s, heroin was killing more young New Yorkers than car crashes, and entire blocks of Harlem were nodding out on the stoops. Frank got rich, selling poison to his own people, and no chinchilla coat changes that arithmetic. Here's a detail that tells you who Frank was at his peak. He kept his own hours, like a banker. Dressed quiet, drove quiet cars, went to bed early. The man who owned a $100,000 chinchilla understood the lesson of that coat better than anyone. Too late, but he understood it. For a while, he was also protected by the oldest shield in New York. Corrupt cops. The elite narcotics detectives of the Special Investigations Unit shook down dealers across the city, taking cash, taking product, reselling it. Frank paid like everyone paid. And here's the number that tells you how rotten it was. Of the roughly 70 detectives who passed through that unit, more than 50 were eventually indicted or implicated. The movie shows a lone, corrupt detective terrorizing Frank. But by late 1974, the shield was cracking. Federal agents had flipped couriers inside the pipeline. Wiretaps were live on the Country Boys, and the brothers were sloppy on the phones in a way Frank never would have been. Surveillance teams followed shipments rolling out of military bases. And across the river in New Jersey, there was Richie Roberts, a Newark kid, built like the athlete he'd been, who worked narcotics by day and put himself through law school at night, with a reputation for being unbribable in an era when that made him a freak. Roberts and a federal strike force were building case files with Frank's name on the cover, tracking blue magic backwards from Jersey corners to the source. 2 investigations, 2 states, 1 target. The movie shows Frank killing a rival in broad daylight on 116th Street to make a point, a story Frank himself loved to tell. The court record never charged him with it, and the accounts vary wildly. What the record does show is a man who thought blood loyalty made him invisible, while the government listened to his brothers order kilos over the phone. On the morning of January 28, 1975, the cars turned onto his quiet street in Teaneck. Now watch the takedown, piece by piece, because it was a scheme, too, just pointed the other way. The opportunity was Frank's cash problem. Empires, that big bleed paper, deeds, deposit boxes, and suitcases that don't fit in any bank. The inside connection was his own pipeline, the flipped couriers feeding routes and dates to the government. The execution came at breakfast, and it played out in slow motion. Cars sealing both ends of the street, fists on the door, then the door giving way, boots on the stairs. Julie at the bedroom window, heaving suitcase after suitcase into the cold January air, cash bursting across the frozen lawn like confetti, while agents outside shouted and scrambled. And Frank in his robe in the middle of it, calm as a Sunday morning, asking to see the warrant. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head for years. It didn't help. The money was everything. $584,683 counted off the grass, keys to safe deposit boxes, property deeds, and paperwork pointing offshore. And the problem, for Frank this time, was that the government had him twice. In 1976, a federal jury convicted him and a judge handed down 70 years. New Jersey piled on with a state conviction. A special narcotics prosecutor called his operation one of the most outrageous international dope smuggling gangs ever. Frank Lucas, 45 years old, was finished. And then he did the thing no studio would ever put in a trailer. He started talking. Not a little. Everything. Names, routes, stash houses, corrupt connections. The anatomy of the pipeline he'd spent a decade building. Sitting across from the same kind of men who'd hunted him, Frank traded the only currency he had left. The man the movie sells as a gangster's gangster became one of the most productive informants in the history of the drug war. His information fueled cases that produced somewhere around 100 convictions, and the government moved Frank and his family into witness protection while he did it. In 1981, his 70 years quietly became time served plus lifetime parole. 5 years. He served 5 years of a 70-year sentence, paid for with everyone he ever worked with. The empire was gone. The government took what it could find, and Frank always claimed the Cayman millions evaporated along the way. In 1984, he was arrested again, caught trading an ounce of heroin and cash for a kilo of cocaine, and drew 7 more years. The lawyer defending him in court was Richie Roberts. The prosecutor who took him down had become his attorney, and eventually the godfather to Frank's son, Ray. Even his redemption story had a twist nobody would believe in fiction. Everyone else got an ending, too. Ike Atkinson, Sergeant Smack, spent roughly 3 decades behind bars and walked out in 2007, an old man still denying the coffins. Julie did her own short stretch, went home to Puerto Rico, and reunited with Frank in 2006, still in love after everything. Harlem's other heroin king, Nicky Barnes, the one they called Mr. Untouchable, eventually flipped too. That's the part the myths never advertise. At the top of that world, everybody talks. Harlem itself paid the real bill, a generation hollowed out by the product Frank perfected. Frank Lucas died May 30th, 2019, in New Jersey, at 88 years old, having outlived his empire, his enemies, and most of the people who could contradict him. And that brings us to the film one last time. When American Gangster came out, its ending claimed the case led to the conviction of 3/4 of New York's federal drug agents. That was flat out false. Not one DEA agent was convicted because of Frank Lucas, and real agents were angry enough to sue the studio over it. Think about what that means. The movie about the man's life ended on a piece of fiction, because the legend had gotten bigger than anyone's ability to check it. And that, right there, is the final truth of this story. Frank Lucas's purest product was never blue magic. It was the story of Frank Lucas. Half a century later, people are still buying. If this one pulled you in, subscribe and hit the bell for the real stories behind the legends told straight. And drop a comment. Who's next, Nicky Barnes or the real Bumpy Johnson?